as it relates to the economy and a number of topics, hopefully that we can get through in the next couple of minutes. Now, joining me via Zoom is Dr. Marlene Attzs, and she is a development economist and consultant. Dr. Attzs, good morning and welcome to AM Prime.
Good morning, Nikoli. Good morning, Trinidad and Tobago.
Nice. So I really appreciate you joining me to help me unpack some of the things that we've learned in recent days. And one of the things, jumping right into it, had to do with what took place at the BBC World Questions Forum at the Central Bank Auditorium. Now, you would have been one of the panelists on that discussion, but also on stage would have been the Minister of Energy and Energy Affairs, Stuart Young. And when posed with the question as to what are we doing to really ensure a sustainable future for Trinidad and Tobago because of the strong reliance on oil and gas, but diversification really was that effort that people were hoping we would have gotten to a more significant point at this stage in Trinidad and Tobago's development. But the Minister of Energy and Energy Affairs said that we have to be grateful for the oil and gas and what that sector has provided to this country. It was met with some different comments, but jumping into that, what were your initial thoughts, not just on what the minister was saying, but essentially this dependence that we have on oil and gas and trying to balance that with a sustainable future?
All right, thanks for the question, Nikoli. Lots of layers to that question and lots of layers to the response. Yeah. So if you'll permit me just to essentially kind of take us a little bit down history so that we can apply some context. Sure. I think the minister's comment, of course, since he is in fact the Minister of Energy and all matters related to energy in Trinidad and Tobago, there was no surprise there that he would say that. I mean, he did make some qualification on his comment, you know, when there was a sense that the audience at the central bank did not agree with him. Mm-hmm. But just to put some context, so since independence, so let's take it to the 1970s, Trinidad and Tobago enjoyed windfalls in terms of our government's revenues coming from the exportation of crude oil. You know, when the prices skyrocketed in the 1970s, we benefited significantly. And that windfall essentially has been the foundation of the economic prosperity that Trinidad and Tobago has seen. So the development of things like our Point Lisas industrial estates, several of the developments we've seen, the fact that we have fairly good education, healthcare systems. I mean, we can discuss how those things have been unpacked over the decades, mm-hmm. and whether or not we've seen the kind of development trajectory that we would like to see in some specific areas. But I think that foundation from the 1970s, then there was the sharp decline in energy prices in the 1980s, which led to us going into a structural adjustment program with the International Monetary Fund. And then into the 1990s, the 2000s, the current century in which we find ourselves. And essentially, there has been some volatility in terms of the energy sector. Now, while the energy sector, oil and gas, has brought a lot of prosperity to Trinidad and Tobago, it has also brought a lot of volatility in terms of government's revenues. So in 2008, there was a global financial crisis, which led to a significant decline in energy prices. And of course, since then, Trinidad and Tobago's economy has been waxing and waning in terms of government's revenues, essentially as a result of what has been happening externally to the price of oil and gas. Price of oil and gas, really the foundation of Trinidad's economic pillar. Now, all of that to say is that it's understandable that Minister Young would essentially use the opportunity to sing the praises of the hydrocarbon sector because it has been significant. Trinidad and Tobago enjoys on the Human Development Index, which is a global measure of how countries are doing on the development trajectory. Trinidad and Tobago enjoys the rank of about 0.8. The highest is 1. Trinidad and Tobago is 0.8 in terms of our index, and that I think equates to high human development. Now, we can have a conversation about the data that they use to arrive at that, and whether or not we think it actually reflects, correctly reflects what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago. But I think the first point I want to make is, yes, the oil and gas sector has been the platform on which Trinidad and Tobago has built its economy. So we ought to be grateful, but there is, of course, a flip side to that. And, you know, there's something in the economics literature, political economy literature, particularly looking at economies that are heavily dependent on natural resources, where we talk about the resource curse and the Dutch disease, meaning essentially that countries that are so heavily dependent on these natural resources. Now, remember with the natural resources, you simply extract a barrel of oil or you extract gas and you earn revenue. And very often the extraction is done by multinational companies. And depending on the price of the oil or depending on the price of the gas, you earn a significant, the country where the natural resources being extracted earns an awful lot of money. And that is what has happened to Trinidad and Tobago. And the resource curse and the Dutch disease tells us that in those kinds of economies, you run the risk of being so heavily dependent on that natural resource that you don't focus on economic diversification and you don't focus on other sectors to essentially balance off what will inevitably happen when your resource, your supply of those natural resources eventually declines. Yes. And that is essentially what has happened or what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago. We're in the state now where we have insufficient gas to supply our downstream industries, and that is causing some concern in terms of government's revenues. We're in the space now where oil and gas prices are not as robust as they were in the 1970s or even decades thereafter, and we are facing that. So while Minister Young was accurate in saying that we should be grateful, I think there is a flip side to that, which we, the people of Trinidad and Tobago, need to be aware of and to essentially divorce ourselves from the politics of the day and the politics of the economy and understand what is happening in our economic space. So yes, it has been a blessing, but I think there also have been opportunities for us, missed opportunities for us to diversify the economy for that day, for that time, for that period when we no longer enjoy the revenues from the oil and gas sector.
Now, one of the things I was recently paying some attention to Norway, which has a population of about 5.5 million, and they produce on average just over 2 million barrels of oil per day. And when you compare what they've been able to do in Norway and to Trinidad and Tobago insofar as using the revenue that they would have received from the oil and gas sector and putting that aggressively into sustainable development. So they have really put some benchmarks that they are far ahead of in respect of public transportation, going electric, all federal vehicles and so on. But what it showed me, if anything, was that there existed the political will to enact those kinds of changes. In Trinidad and Tobago, I think that we are ripe for those kinds of investments and opportunities. But one keeps questioning whether or not Trinidad and Tobago is on a path to diversification. Now, as an economist and looking on at what the government has been able to do over the past couple of years, where would you say we are along that path to development and diversification specifically?
Well, I think we're not as advanced. Certainly, we can't compare ourselves to Norway. In fact, considering the Human Development Index to which I referred a little while ago, I think Norway might be ranked number 1 or certainly the top 5 in that Human Development Index, because you are correct. On all indicators, and the Human Development Index looks at issues such as education, health issues and per capita income. And there would be some other considerations inside of there in terms of issues like how you treat the environment, et cetera, et cetera. I think we're not as advanced as we could have been. And while we may wish to focus on the politics of the day and in terms of whether or not successive governments have in fact been committed to economic diversification in Trinidad and Tobago, I think the conversation, there is an opportunity for us to expand that conversation, because I am firmly of the view that politicians are in fact servants of the people, and they are in fact required to to act in the best interest of the people, but the people need to understand the dynamics of the economic space, of the social space, and the people need to have a very clear sense. We, the people, need to have a very clear sense of what we would wish to have our politicians do on our behalf. Yeah. And I think that's the first thing, that generally the population of Trinidad and Tobago may not be as educated, and I don't mean certified, may not be as okura with the social and economic issues that impact on Trinidad and Tobago, and may not be as okura with how our heavy dependence on the oil and gas sector cannot be sustained, and the need for us to have economic diversification. Yeah. And economic diversification really has to have a kind of ecosystem approach. What are the enabling environments that are required for Trinidad and Tobago to successfully diversify our economy? And an important part of that is, of course, our education system.
Yes.
And so we move into issues. I think you keep talking about sustainable development. You keep mentioning that. And there are things called the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, to which several governments around the world, including the government of Trinidad and Tobago, are signatories. And we're meant to deliver some deliverables by 2030. Yes. And, if you were to ask a fundamental question, to what extent are the SDGs part and parcel of our education system, so that as a collective, we are working towards, in small ways, so at the primary school level, the conversations around renewable energy, conversations around what could be done to reduce your carbon footprint as an individual, at the primary school level, at the secondary school level, at the tertiary level, and then essentially building from the ground up to the political level, where, the responsibility lies for a national response to the SDGs. And to me, conversations around economic diversification and what I would also like to include in that, a conversation around structural adjustment. And I don't mean structural adjustment in the way in which it was implemented in the 1980s under the IMF structural adjustment program, but structurally reshaping our economic system so that we recognize that a dependence on the energy sector is not sustainable, and that we have to prepare for a future where our oil and gas fortunes may not be as robust as they have been in the past. And I think those conversations should have started some time ago, but I think certainly now, where the population, I think, has a greater sense of our vulnerability to what is happening in the global energy market. I think now is the time for us to really kind of take a deep dive to leveraging the global economic circumstances to help our population understand what is happening, and then take us, kind of insist on the government or the political directorate of the day taking us in a direction that could lead us to a more sustainable future.
Now, one of the tools I think that is put in place to help would be the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, because when this country experiences a surplus in our income versus revenue, we see a deposit being made to the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. The purpose that most of us who know about the fund, who pay attention, who are educated, and that speaks to the education that you're mentioning, because the average citizen, young people, many people are not as accurate about this kind of information about the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. But one of the things that we learned recently is when it comes to withdrawals and so forth, the fund actually is currently at the same level when the government came into office back in 2015. But it took a newspaper article coming out, the Minister of Finance becoming irate about that newspaper article, and then we saw coming out of the ministry about 16 points relative to the Heritage and Stabilization Fund that on a normal basis, it does not seem as though there is enough effort or energy being put into educating the population. What do you make of that entire ecosystem or lack thereof when it comes to putting out that kind of pertinent information to the population?
Well, I have to say I'm extremely happy that the media house published what they published last Sunday, and that the Minister of Finance became so irate that the population was able to get a 16-point fact sheet on the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. I mean, the minister in his response said that the the documentation had been laid, the annual report for the Heritage and Civilization Fund had been laid in Parliament. But as we know, as good Trinbagonians, we don't necessarily pay attention to documents that are laid in Parliament. But seriously speaking, I think that as part of transparency and accountability, I think what came out as a response to the media article, I think, should now become par for the course for the population. I think, the Sunday newspapers, I think it would make for nice Sunday reading if every year or twice a year some kind of report is published in the Sunday newspapers and published across all media platforms, so that the population gets a clear snippet of what is happening to our fund. It is called formally the Heritage and Civilization Fund, but it's really the fund of the people of Trinidad and Tobago.
Understood.
Managed by the government of the day under the direction of a board that oversees functioning and the investment portfolio for the Heritage and Civilization Fund. And as you had mentioned, Norway some time ago, countries like Norway, Saudi Arabia, all of the countries that have their economic fortunes pegged on natural resources, there is something called a sovereign wealth fund. That's a broad framework within which these funds are in fact established, and ours in Trinidad and Tobago is called the Heritage and Civilization Fund. And yes, you're correct. It is meant to be. I mean, the thing about our fund, which is, it's a little sticking point for some of us who look at these issues, is that we have it for both heritage and stabilization. So the heritage part of it means that we're leaving something for future generations. So that is the sustainable development aspect of it. But the stabilization part of it means that we can dip into the fund, the government of the day can dip into the fund if they are experiencing significant fiscal deficits. So there are shortfalls in terms of their revenue projections as opposed to their expenditures. They can actually go into the heritage. The legislation for the Heritage and Civilization Fund allows for the government to draw down funds. So there was drawdown during the COVID-19 pandemic. That unforeseen crisis of significant proportions, the government dipped into the Heritage and Civilization Fund to provide social relief and to help finance, resources for the health sector, because that was a crisis. I mean, we understood that was a crisis. But there have been those of us suggesting, and I was part of the Economic Development Advisory Board, which the government of the day established back in 2015, 2016. And one of the first things that we did was present a position paper suggesting that there be a separation of the heritage as opposed to the stabilization parts of it, so that in terms of the heritage part of the fund, we don't touch that. We leave something for future generations. And the stabilization is kept as a kind of separate fund to allow the government to access it as and when it may be required, particularly under situations of economic crisis, quote unquote.
Now, I want to get one last question in, at least before I leave you, and it has to do with the region as a whole. CARICOM is celebrating 50 years, and we're seeing that taking place next month, where Trinidad and Tobago is actually playing a large role in terms of the celebrations with respect to that 50th anniversary. And of course, we know the Treaty of Chaguaramas and so forth, so it bears a great significance. But the young person, the average young person, may not be as accurate about CARICOM, and I believe that for the future generations, a lack of interest, a lack of understanding, a lack of appeal when it comes to young people for CARICOM can be very disastrous for our economies moving forward, integration, and how as a region we move to the next level. I just really wanted to get your thoughts in terms of what are we doing wrong, or what can we do better, as a matter of fact, in terms of that engagement of citizens when it comes to regional bodies, because it has this economic relevance, but also this social and cultural relevance.
It's a loaded question, Nikoli, but one that I welcome given my daytime job, my full-time job. I think you're correct. I think we really have not had a very deep conversation across all levels on issues related to CARICOM. I suspect by the time the celebrations come around, it would probably be during the school holidays. So I don't know what, if anything, is going to be done at the level of the education system in terms of ensuring that our younger persons, our primary or secondary school students, are involved, are engaged, have a sense of understanding. And one of the reasons I feel strongly about this is, again, coming back to the whole question of sustainable development. In 5, 10, 15 years' time, our leaders, not just nationally, but our leaders regionally, will come from the Gen Ys and the Gen Zs, those younger persons, the millennials, even the alpha generation. And what are we doing to ensure that there is a deep appreciation for Caribbean history, for Caribbean economics, for those issues that impact not simply Trinidad and Tobago, but those issues that impact the region. And I think it's an opportunity that should not be missed, because I think too much of our Caribbean history is unknown, and it is therefore lost. And there are many issues that impact on us across the region. We have conversations around migration, for example. We have conversations around the CARICOM single market and economy. What does that mean for a student who wants to study in Trinidad and Tobago, but that student might be based in Belize? We keep hearing anecdotal stories about what is happening in Haiti, but how many of us in the region actually appreciate what is happening to our Haitian brothers and sisters? How many of us appreciate what it means when Prime Minister Mia Mottley in Barbados proposes the Bridgetown Initiative? What does that mean for us in the region and in terms of climate change? What does it mean for us in the region when Vice President Kamala Harris comes to the Bahamas to have a meeting with CARICOM heads of government? And I think too many of these issues are not sufficiently aired or articulated or form part of our public education systems. And I fear that in the future that we're going to be starting essentially from a tabula rasa. So when we appoint persons to be future leaders, what is the knowledge base, what is the institutional framework that they're going to be taking with them when they essentially receive the baton as leaders in the region? So I really think it's important, and I'm hoping that more information will be made available in the public domain about the Treaty of Chaguaramas, about its significance. I mean, if I were to say on the program now, 1 from 10 leaves note, I mean, I don't know how many of your listeners or your viewers will understand the significance of that in the context of Caribbean regional development.
Now, the restriction of time on our interviews and our discussions, I mean, it's so annoying, but it leaves room for future conversations, of course. I want to say thank you so much for joining me this morning and unpacking a lot of those topics that we've spoken to this morning. I had many follow-up questions, but unfortunately, I know that we have to leave it there. Dr. Attzs, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Most welcome. Have a wonderful day and a good weekend. And happy Father's Day to the fathers out there.
Indeed.